A team of scientists squeezes through a passage barely wider than a letterbox deep beneath South Africa, expecting fossils, but instead finds more than 1,500 twisted bones from a creature with a brain no bigger than an orange. Yet what these remains reveal is a burial performed by hands not quite human, and it threatens everything we thought about our origins. How could a non-human mind create ritual in total darkness, and what else still waits in the cave's final chamber? Rick Hunter and Steve Tucker pressed their bodies into the limestone, shoulders scraping rock, breath echoing in the silence. The only way forward was Superman's crawl, a slot less than 10 inches high, barely enough for a grown man's chest. Every inch demanded a calculation. Twist sideways, exhale, slide. The air thickened, stale and unmoving, as the light from their headlamps flickered against the walls. Behind them, the surface world faded to memory. Ahead, the passage narrowed again, forcing them to flatten themselves like shadows, ribs pressed to stone. The darkness beyond the next bend was absolute. There was no hint of daylight, no breeze, nothing but the sound of their own hearts. The cave pressed in, indifferent to fear or fatigue. Hands scraped over rough stone, knees bruised raw. In that blackness, the mind played tricks, every sound amplified, every breath a reminder of the stone above. Then a glint. Not quartz, not a trick of the light, but the unmistakable curve of bone half embedded in the silt. The realization snapped the air taut. This was no animal. The chamber head opened just enough for two bodies to squeeze through, revealing a geometry no map had ever traced. The bones lay undisturbed, untouched by predator or flood, waiting in the dark. Getting here was not luck. Only the smallest could make it. No ordinary scientists, but a team chosen for their size and their willingness to risk suffocation for a chance at discovery. The cave did not give up its secrets easily, and the first bones were only the beginning. 6 scientists, each chosen for their slight build and steady nerves, assembled at the cave's mouth before dawn. They called themselves the Underground Astronauts. No one else could fit through the vertical chute, a shaft barely wide enough for a child's shoulders, plunging straight down into the earth. Ropes, harnesses, and helmets were their only protection. Every descent was a one-way trip into a world that had trapped bones for 250,000 years. Inside the Dinaledi Chamber, the team moved with the precision of surgeons and the caution of divers under ice. One person mapped the position of every bone with laser-guided instruments, while another brushed away sediment with a child's paintbrush. Each fragment, some no bigger than a tooth and others whole long bones, was bagged, labelled and logged. The process was slow, almost ritualistic. No one spoke above a whisper. Over days and nights the bags piled up femurs, skull pieces, vertebrae, ribs, more than 1,500 fragments in all, representing at least 15 separate individuals. The remains included infants, adults and elders, an entire population sealed in darkness. The only non-human bones belonged to a single owl. Every other trace was Homo Naledi. Extraction meant working shoulder to shoulder in spaces so tight that even breathing felt like a risk. Each bone's removal required choreography. One scientist would gently cradle the specimen, another would guide the bag, a third would record the find. Above them the rock pressed down, unyielding. But the chamber gave up its dead, one careful handful at a time. The evidence was leaving the cave at last, ready to tell its story on the surface. But the true nature of what those bones revealed would only become clear under the harsh light of analysis. The first bones to reach the surface looked almost human, until the details came into focus. The hand was the size of a child, but the fingers curled in a permanent arc, built for gripping rough stone. Shoulders flared wide and high, more like an ape than a modern person, shaped for climbing rather than throwing. Yet the legs told a different story. Long, straight and capped with feet that could have left tracks beside our own, they hinted at a life spent walking upright, step by step with early humans. The skull fragments, though, shattered any sense of familiarity. Pieced together, the brain case could barely cradle an orange. At just 450 to 600 cubic centimetres, it was less than half the size of a modern human's. Even Neanderthals and Homo erectus, our ancient cousins, had brains twice as large. For decades, scientists believed that complex behaviour required a big brain. Intelligence, ritual, even grief were the exclusive territory of species with skulls to match. But here, in the Dinaledi Chamber, the evidence refused to fit the old rules. These creatures climbed like primates, walked like people, and carried a brain smaller than any living child's. The paradox was impossible to ignore. How could a being with such a tiny brain have done something so deliberate as carrying their dead into the heart of the earth? The bones themselves posed a question that science was not ready to answer. Bones were scattered in dense clusters, pressed into the mud as if laid there on purpose. No claw marks, no tooth-worn edges, no sign of animal scavengers or the violent sorting that comes from a flood. Instead, the chamber's silt cradled articulated limbs and partial skeletons, sometimes still connected, as if the bodies had been placed whole and left undisturbed. The concentration of remains told its own story. Infants, adults, elders, an entire spectrum of ages gathered in one impossible place. Dating of the sediments and the flowstone capping the bones fixed their age between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago, long before the first known human burials on other continents. Lee Berger, the scientist who first argued the case, saw a pattern that defied accident. The Dinaledi Chamber was too remote, its crawl spaces too narrow to be a natural trap. Bodies would have to be carried one by one through a twisting maze of stone, guided by hands that could see in the dark or by minds that planned for the dead. The absence of water-worn debris and the presence of only hominin bones, save a single owl, left few alternatives. If not by flood or beast, then by intention. For Berger, this was more than disposal. It hinted at a ritual, a repeated act performed over generations with meaning carried in silence. The bones formed a record of decisions made in total darkness, a non-human mind grappling with mortality. Yet even this explanation raised further questions. How did small-brained creatures navigate such blackness? What drove them to return again and again to a place where only the dead waited? The answer, if it existed, lay deeper in the cave's shadows. No sunlight has ever touched the Dinaledi Chamber. The blackness is so complete that even the bravest cavers lose all sense of direction without artificial light. Yet on the ceilings and walls above the bone clusters, researchers found thin layers of soot, microscopic traces of burned material clinging to the rock. In the sediment, fragments of animal bone showed signs of charring, their surfaces cracked and darkened by heat. These clues suggest that someone or something once brought fire into this abyss. Navigating the maze of stone without light would be nearly impossible. The presence of soot and burned bone means that deep inside the cave, far from any natural flame, fire was carried and controlled. This was not a single accidental spark. It was repeated journeys with torches or embers, each trip requiring planning, memory, and purpose. The darkness itself became part of the ritual, lit only by hands that understood what waited in the black. Near the silent clusters of bone, researchers documented cross-hatched marks etched into the cave wall. Laboratory dating placed the surface at roughly 250,000 years old. If authentic, these lines would predate the oldest known human art by at least 100,000 years. The claim ignited a storm in academic circles. Critics demanded micromorphological analysis, arguing that without microscopic sediment studies or chemical tests, the markings could be scratches from natural processes or recent contamination. Peer reviewers split. Some called for more rigorous sampling, while others warned against rewriting evolutionary history on ambiguous evidence. The debate sharpened into a single, unsettling question. If these engravings are real, does our definition of humanity survive the discovery? Today, the boundaries separating human from non-human grow thinner with every find. If a small-brained hominin could mourn, create and ritualize, our definitions of consciousness and our place in nature are no longer certain. The cave's darkness still echoes with questions science has yet to answer. What do you think?